Hello and welcome. I want to thank every library for inviting us to present this very important conversation today. My name is Ricky Levy, and I'm the president and CEO of the Woodhull Freedom Foundation. Woodhull was founded in 2003, and our mission is to affirm sexual freedom as a fundamental human right. One of the biggest focuses of our work right now is censorship. A few weeks ago, we held Woodhull's Human Rights Commission focused on the censorship of sexual freedom. We'll be continuing the work that we began at that commission, and we'll be collecting testimonies from individuals who are directly impacted by censorship. My two co-presenters today were part of that commission, and I'm especially delighted to be able to bring you their brilliance and passion today. Censorship of sexual freedom is the canary in the gold mine. If the current trends toward more and more censorship are allowed to continue, we will end up living in a country that resembles a fascist regime, where all speech is controlled by the government. It's an issue that everyone should be concerned about because it will affect everyone. It's the overarching issue that impacts 97% of our advocacy work, education, and our fundamental human rights. Digital books and Google have taken people out of the miracle of libraries and into the world of the internet with instant access to books and information. But if and when the government succeeds in their relentless drive to shut down access to information online, there will still be libraries, and we have to fight to keep them. Libraries are wonderful, radical places. Not everyone has access to the internet, but libraries are free to everyone. I'm going to introduce you now to the two panelists who are joining me today, and I'm actually going to read their bios because they're so phenomenal. I don't want to miss one thing. So I want to introduce you to Will Creeley. Since joining FIRE in 2006, Will has successfully defended expressive rights and core civil liberties worldwide. As legal director, Will coordinates FIRE's legal advocacy and oversees FIRE's litigation, legislative and policy reform, and target advocacy departments. He's appeared on national television and radio. He's spoken to thousands of students, faculty, administrators, and attorneys about First Amendment rights at events across the country. A co-author of First Things First, a modern course book on free speech fundamentals, Will's writing has been published by The Times, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, The Chronicle of Higher Education, and many other outlets. Will edited the second edition of FIRE's Guide to Due Process and Campus Justice, and co-edited the second edition of FIRE's Guide to Free Speech on Campus. He's authored amicus curiae briefs submitted to courts nationwide, including the Supreme Court of the United States and multiple United States Courts of Appeals. Will is a member of the First Amendment Lawyers Association and serves as co-chair of the Education Subcommittee of the American Bar Association's section of Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice. Welcome, Will.
It's an honor. Thank you so much, Ricky. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. Now you know why I read that. Now I'm going to introduce you to Martha Hickson. Martha Hickson has been a high school librarian since 2005. Her work has been featured in School Library Journal, Booklist, Knowledge Quest, the American Library Association Intellectual Freedom Blog, NJEA Review, and School Librarians Workshops. Martha's been a presenter at conferences and webinars, including the American Association of School Librarians, Future Ready Librarians, and the New Jersey Association of School Librarians. Martha's defense of intellectual freedom has been recognized with awards from the New Jersey Association of School Librarians, the New Jersey Library Association, the American Association of School Librarians, and the National Council of Teachers of English. In June, the American Library Association presented Martha with the Lemony Snicket Prize for Noble Librarians Faced with Adversity. That was in recognition of her energy and bravery in the face of persistent and ongoing hostility, while she was advocating for students' First Amendment's right to read. In November, the National Coalition Against Censorship will be presenting Martha with the Judith Krug Outstanding Librarian Award. Welcome, Martha.
Thank you.
So, let me ask some questions. I love questions. We are currently witnessing a major increase in book bans and attacks on library boards across the country. PEN America reports that 1,586 books were banned from July 1st, 2021 to March 31st, 2022. 41% of those, that's 644 individual bans, are tied to directives from state officials or elected lawmakers to investigate or remove books. So, Will, why do you think we're seeing this trend right now?
Well, first, Ricky, thanks for the introduction. It's an honor to be here with Martha, and hello to everybody watching. It's a pleasure, a real honor. As the son of a poet and a professor, libraries are home for me, so this is a big deal. And to answer your excellent question, I think there are a lot of reasons why books are on the chopping block right now. I think we live in an intensely polarized country. That's not going to be breaking news to anybody hearing this. And I think that libraries are a soft target. They are a way for folks to exercise some sense of power and control over a changing world. It's an easy scapegoat. If we can only control what people read, then these problems as we imagine them to be will be solved, right? It's the classic ostrich syndrome, I think, a little bit. If you can't see it, you can't hear it, you can't read it, well, it doesn't exist. Let's go back to the good old days. Of course, that's not a workable solution in any sense. But I think it's important to note, too, that book banning and attacks on access to information, it's an old American trend. It's an old civilizational trend, an old human trend, quite frankly. But focusing on this country in particular, this is something that we see again and again. I think every generation has its experience of folks telling them what they can't read, what they better not read, what they better not listen to. I remember going into record stores, and seeing the parental advisory stickers and thinking, boy, I really want to get that album. Let me listen to this Prince album. Let me listen to this Dr. Dre album and find out what's going on. Let me hear the things that are so dangerous that I can't have ready access to them. And then just this summer, I read this fascinating book, really galvanizing book that kind of reminded me that this is cyclical. Amy Sohn's book, The Man Who Hated Women. And it's a history of attempts to censor discussion of birth control, of free love, of suffrage, of women's rights in the Gilded Age, led by the notorious censor Anthony Comstock. And the book is less about Comstock and more about the women and men that he targeted, that he drove in some tragic instances to suicide by his dogged attempt to stop them from talking about birth control and basic facts of human biology, emerging discussions of how best to raise a family or to love one another. So again, these are trends that will recur. We're in the midst of a hell of a one right now. I think PEN America has rightfully called it unprecedented. Likewise, the American Library Association. I don't have to tell the folks listening to me now that the amplification that social media has added the fuel to the fire here, I think, to make it feel all the more pressing, personal, and frankly dangerous. So that's not news. But just to zoom out and provide that historical perspective, the reason I call Amy Sohn's book galvanizing is because it reminds me that there's a way through this, and that's by organizing, by persistence, by bravery of the type that Martha has certainly demonstrated. Many folks listening now have demonstrated. So I'm trying to keep my eyes on the prize here, right? You got to be an optimist to do this work. And that's true of First Amendment lawyers. I'm sure that's true of librarians.
Thank you. So, Martha, I just read this morning, I think it was this morning. No, it was the other day, a teacher who only told her class about a book ban and a campaign to end the book ban and provided a QR code to the class and was suspended just for talking about the banning of books. So, what are you seeing in your library and your community?
Yeah, that case that you referenced, Ricky, is in Oklahoma, and that's chilling. The teacher provided a QR code to the Brooklyn Public Library, which earlier this year stepped up and said, you know, kids, if you can't access books at your library, we're giving you free access to the ebooks here. And I have provided that to my own students. And in Oklahoma, that cost a teacher her job, which is just terrible. Will mentioned that libraries are soft targets, and I agree with that. And I think school libraries are especially soft targets. Generally, school librarians are sole practitioners. I often say that running a school library is like teaching full time while trying to run a small business. So we are one-armed paper hangers, just trying to keep it together. And we are seeing much of what Will referenced in my district in New Jersey, where you wouldn't expect this to happen, a blue state. But I am in a red county in a blue state. Over the last year, we have seen showing up at our board meetings protests from parents against critical race theory, against social and emotional learning. And in conjunction with that, last September came challenges against 5 books, all with LGBTQ themes. All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, Fun Home by Alison Bechtel, Genderqueer by Maya Kababe, which, as most of our listeners know, was the most challenged book in the United States in the past year, Lawn Boy by Jonathan Evison, and This Book is Gay by Juno Dawson. And in this district, I've been here, I've just started my 18th year. This is my first week of school. I just survived my first week of school.
Yay!
Objections to books on the basis of sexual content or language aren't new in this district. Over the 18 years I've been here, there have been occasional controversies, discussions about books like Looking for Alaska by John Green, Me Talk Pretty One Day by David Sedaris, Where the Heart Is by Billy Letts. But the difference is that those objections followed the established process and policy. And by that, I mean the parent or parents who were concerned about those books began the process with a conversation. And that is so important to have a conversation rather than immediately go to battle. And the conversation would involve me listening to the parent's concern and then talking to the parent about the literary value of the work, the relevance to the current world or to the class or the instruction, the way the book reflects society, the way it could stimulate creativity, just talking about the book in context rather than in isolation. And the interesting thing about library books, which many parents forget when they're in this objecting phase, is this is independent reading. So if for some reason, whatever, the book doesn't match your student, your family, your values, close the book. Let's talk about what else would be a better fit for you, because we have 20,000 choices here in this library, and together we can choose something else. What's very different right now in this climate, this divisive climate that Will referenced, is we're not having conversations anymore. Right. We are going automatically from 0 to 11, and people are showing up at board meetings ready for battle. And the tactics and talking points that they're using, which we saw displayed at our September board meeting last year, are happening all over the place. You have a small group of parents who bypass board policies completely. They ambush a board meeting. And in addition to attacking the books, reading passages out of context and in isolation, they've also started attacking library staff. At our September board meeting last year, they accused me by name of being a sex offender. And we're seeing those very same tactics and talking points being used nationwide. And in fact, in many cases, it's the exact same books being attacked nationwide. And that demonstrates that this isn't an organic concern demonstrated by a single parent or family. This is an organized, coordinated effort. It's a tactic called astroturfing, where larger organizations take advantage of local people on the ground to make it appear that it's a local concern, but it's really a much bigger movement controlled by corporate and political operatives. In this case, we're talking about far right-wing Christian agenda being put forth through organizations like Moms for Liberty, No Left Turn in Education, the Heritage Foundation, which, as you know, has significant funding from the Koch brothers. And recently, we've heard a lot about Patriot Media down in Texas, which is a communications company whose political action committee spent $600,000 to successfully flip 4 school boards and turn them in a very conservative direction, which is having devastating consequences in those districts. So it's not really about the books here. They don't care about the particular books. They haven't even read the particular books, which you can tell by the challenges. The real goal here is to undermine public education in America and to promote the far right-wing agenda.
Whew. I have all kinds of questions now. Students, what do you see, Martha, in your work with young people? Are they as divided as the I don't want to say adults, as the people not in school are, along the lines of censorship and what books are available or not available? How do you see this censorship affecting them directly?
I think my view is somewhat skewed in that the population of students that comes into the library obviously has a very favorable disposition toward books and readings. There is a much larger population that does not come into the library. In high school, they have so many activities and responsibilities that that's understandable. It's no shade against those who don't come in. But among that subset of those who don't come in are those who are 100% on board with let's ban the books. But among my library users and their allies, they are appalled. So the result has been that those students, a large proportion of our students, mainstream parents in the community and mainstream members of the broader community have risen up to oppose the challenges to the books and the attempts to ban books in our district. After the manufactured outrage that we saw at our September board meeting last year, dozens of our students attended the board meetings in October, November, January. There was no meeting in December. Many of them were members or allies of the students who belong to our gender and sexuality alliances. And those kids stood up and faced the jeers and hostility from the people who were attempting to challenge the books. They actually taunted these students at these board meetings. And those kids, in the most eloquent, passionate way possible, expressed their outrage at seeing materials that are written for them targeted for removal. They talked about the importance of seeing their lived experience represented in their school library. And they articulated the fact that they can see that the attacks on these books are really an attempt to erase and silence them. They called it out. And they, as I said, they did so in the most eloquent way, and they were models for civil discourse. They put the book banners to shame in terms of their professionalism and voice at the microphone. And I say all that to remind everybody who's with us today that student voice and representation are critical in defending against book challenges. I can talk till I'm blue in the face, but to hear a kid talk about it is a whole other thing. The board will actually listen to them. And our results proved it. I don't want to, spoiler alert, but the board voted to retain all 5 of our challenge books. And that's not the best part. Thank you. That's not the best part. The best part is this. So that happened in January. The board said, yes, you're keeping the books. In June of our 2 GSA groups, they're called one. We have 2 schools in our district. One group is called Prism, the other is called Spectrum. The members of those 2 groups received the New Jersey Library Association's 2022 Intellectual Freedom Award for their activism in defending the First Amendment. I had the great pleasure of sitting with several of those students in a ballroom in Atlantic City, watching them take the stage as an entire ballroom of librarians erupted in cheers and rose to their feet to give the kids a standing ovation. I'm getting chills talking about it again just now.
I'm getting
proudest moment of my
up,
career.
actually. Yes.
So proud. So that's how kids
wonderful.
are involved. That's how kids respond.
Oh. Well, so we know that what we're seeing banned focuses heavily on, as you said, Martha, LGBTQ plus characters and storylines, as well as references to sex and sexuality. Of course, our history is up for grabs and being restricted constantly. But there's a history of going after sexual speech. I wonder, Will, could you tell us a little more about the history?
Yeah, absolutely.
And while you're doing that, would you elaborate on the protections that are available?
Yes, I will do both those things. I'd be happy
Thank
to.
you.
It takes me a minute to catch my breath after that moving story by Martha. Yeah, that felt good. That was worth waking up for today and joining you all. Yes, as a reference, I think earlier, the history of banning sexual expression in particular in this country is unfortunately a long one. One of the most famous obscenity trials in our nation's history, Allen Ginsberg's Howl, right? Anything that challenges the status quo having to do with sex has historically been targeted for repression, for censorship, from top down silencing. And that's no different today. That's a long story. And I mentioned Comstock before, but also the history of obscenity law in this country is driven in significant part by state efforts to ban discussions of LGBT lifestyle, right? Of just basic writing about what it means to be gay in this country. The Supreme Court, in its long walk in the jurisprudential desert on its way to arriving finally at a relatively, well, frankly, extraordinarily speech protective definition of obscenity in Miller v. California, had all kinds of stumbling blocks, and many of them involved speech about sex outside of the married heterosexual quote unquote traditional arrangement. And that perhaps most famously in the case of One Magazine, which was publishing works by gay authors about being gay and was targeted as obscene. I mean, people were going to jail and being arrested for these types of discussions. So again, in a sense, what's old is new again with these latest attacks that Martha so eloquently described and her students so valiantly stood against. I think that as we wrote, Ricky, in our recent friend of the court brief submitted to Virginia State Court in defense of the right to possess and sell copies of Genderqueer and, interestingly enough, A Court of Mist and Fury, which is just a general kind of fantasy book. I remember I've seen my wife check it out from our local library, and I said, they're coming for that book, right? She says, I better read it now, and it makes it more interesting. Again, there's that kind of reverse effect that when you try and ban something, it becomes more interesting. But so we wrote in that amicus brief that, as always, it's the speech of groups without political power. It's minority voices, dissenting voices, voices that are outside the representation, voices that aren't the 50% plus one needed to achieve electoral representation. Those are the voices that go after, that politicians go after and censors go after. And frankly, I think the kind of clearest way to explain it is almost as a form of bullying, right? You pick on folks who don't have, seemingly don't have the power to stand up for themselves, whether at the ballot box or because of the power differentials of students and school boards and so forth. So that's been a long history. Or frankly, thinking about the history of sexual speech, people whose sexual identities were criminalized for decades, right? So, I mean, it's awful hard to organize when you can't even publish a magazine, right? It's awfully hard to exercise political power when, thinking of the writer Jonathan Rauch has written that your very existence is illegal. So those are, again, thinking of just like school libraries being particularly soft targets, underrepresented minorities, particularly folks who are living lifestyles outside of what the societies for years considered normative or traditional, right? Those are the folks who are attacked. So long answer. That's what we're seeing historically, and what's resurging again here. What protections are there? Well, I mentioned before, the obscenity standard is a high one. It's very, very high. You're talking about speech that is published that lacks serious literary, artistic, political, scientific value. As we wrote in our brief defending Court of Mist and Fury and Genderqueer, these are books that are of intense interest to particular audiences. And as the Virginia state courts have held in that particular jurisdiction, that you don't have to have books that are of general interest to everybody. If they find an audience among students, maybe it's the Gay Straight Alliance at the school, and maybe those are the students who these books speak to, that's enough. That's the kind of value, the serious literary, artistic, political, social value that the test considers. And if you can show that it has that value, you're good, right? The First Amendment protects it. The kind of partisan, politically driven attacks that we've seen, and I think Martha accurately describes them, those are efforts to pull down books just based purely on their viewpoint, just based purely on their politics. And that is not consistent with the First Amendment protections as they've been developed in the courts. So I encourage everybody to check out our website, thefire.org. If I may just get in that quick plug for a copy of this brief, which lays out both the history and the applicable legal standards in depth, far better than I can do here. But in a word, the protections are there, and they're serious, and they're high. It's not so easy as a couple of folks getting mad at a school board meeting or a couple of politicians in Virginia filing a motion to have a book declared obscene. The First Amendment protects that speech, and I think those efforts will backfire, and backfire spectacularly.
They say that speech that offends no one needs no defense. I think that certainly there is no word in these books that is offensive. There is no language in these books that is offensive. What the people who are seeking to suppress these books find offensive is the reality of LGBTQ plus human beings who really just want to live their lives and not have to go back in a closet. Do librarians have protection?
I'm happy to jump in there. That's a good question. I think that in certain instances, the law is not as protective of librarians as it should be. I'm thinking particularly about this Oklahoma case that Martha referenced earlier and that you referenced earlier, Ricky, where the librarian is engaged, and we're thinking particularly about the K-12 context here, where the librarian engaged in what would be kind of considered classic political protest, right? As I understand it, put kind of construction paper over the books and said, these are the books the state of Oklahoma doesn't want you to see.
Correct.
And was suspended and then resigned as a result of this protest, investigated for putting up the QR code. The protections for in-classroom K-12 teacher speech are fairly minimal in those contexts. Now, you have more of a right off campus, outside of the classroom, if she had tweeted about this on her own time or had put up this display outside of her house, that's one thing. But in the classroom, unlike in the college context, the K-12 teacher rights are perhaps surprisingly weak. In some sense, the rights of the student to receive information might have more First Amendment grounding. The teachers who have made an argument about academic freedom, as we know it in the college context, in the high school context, they have not fared well in the courts. This is an evolving area of the law. We'd certainly be interested in continuing to evolve that area of the law, but that's where we are now. Protections for librarians are also interesting. There's been litigation around the types of books that librarians might be asked to remove. And I think right now the school library context with this court is going to be an area of, again, change. We shall see. If I may, if you'll indulge me, I'll describe quickly the 1902 Supreme Court case that most particularly deals with this issue, where the court most directly addressed the rights of students and these kind of book bans and attempts to challenge books. Here you had, again, with headlines that could be ripped out of the paper today, a school board in Long Island, and the school board members had attended a conservative parents conference and had been handed a list of books to check when they returned back to their district, to check if they're on the library shelves. And sure enough, these books, which included a volume of short stories edited by Langston Hughes, the classic Go Ask Alice, which I remember checking out of my my school library as a kid. They just kind of included kind of classic works of literature, and more than I'm blanking on now. But so they went back to the district, checked these books on the library shelves, found that they were there, and pulled them all off. And then issued a press release essentially saying these books are un-American, they're filthy, they're immoral. We've pulled them all off. So you had partisan actors, right, motivated by purely partisan concerns, pulling books off in a kind of act of vigilante censorship. Wasn't according to any policy, was really top down. We know best. We'll decide for you what you can read. And that's that. So students stood up, filed a lawsuit, and the case goes up to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court shatters, right? There's 7 different opinions produced by this ruling, but the plurality led by Justice William Brennan finds that the students have a right to access information to the extent that they cannot have books pulled off the shelves for nakedly partisan purposes. So that if you are a school board and you march in, you avoid whatever policy or process might be in place, you ignore it, and you march in with nothing, no concerns about age appropriateness, no concerns about whether or not the material would be appropriate for your, say it's a K through 5 library instead of a 9 through 12 library, and just pull the books down because they're on a list. Again, you may not have even read them, to Martha's excellent point earlier. That violates the First Amendment. But because it's a fractured plurality opinion, it has been of limited precedential value. It has not been the shield that it otherwise might have been if it had been a clear holding. In fact, if you look at the last 30, 40 years of case law and precedent after PICO, which is the name of the PICO v. Island Trees School District. I always love Island Trees. But if you look at the jurisprudence following, it's not as clear as you would like. And you see circuit courts saying, well, school boards can pull books that purport to be nonfiction, but it maybe includes some historical inaccuracies and so forth. So there's been nibbling around the edges, and the standard is not as protective as it should be. And again, I worry about what the current court might think, but these challenges are coming. And to tip my hand, if I may, we'd love to bring one, but I'll get to that a little bit later. Long story short, if you have a policy in place and the school board members do not follow that policy and just march into the library and pull the books off the shelf, then First Amendment interests are directly implicated. And I think that violates the Supreme Court's ruling in PICO and would be worthy of a challenge. Absolutely.
Is that literal? If they pull it off the shelves as opposed to telling Martha she has to pull them off the shelves?
I think that it works either way, right? If you have a direction from the school board that says, now hear this, you will pull this book off. It's on this list that we got from X, advocacy group, and we don't care what the reasons are. We don't care what the policy is. We just want it off the shelves now. Or you receive a letter from a state legislator that says, we want to know if these 800 titles are on your shelves. You better pull them off, which we've seen in Texas. Or if you, or if you allow challenges from members of the community, and next thing you know, you're pulling down everything from Anne Frank to the Bible, as we also saw this week. I mean, the headlines are such that I can't keep up these days. Each time I think I've seen, the worst of it, I get another email. So, again, I don't have to tell this group. I certainly don't have to tell Martha. So the attacks are spiraling. And my point about that vigilante censorship, if you have a policy, Justice Brennan, in his opinion, says if the school board had followed the policy and the policy had allowed for some kind of consideration that did consider, quote unquote, viewpoint neutral factors like age appropriateness or other objective factors, then maybe, or pedagogical relevance to the age group, et cetera, then maybe we'd have a different case here. But we didn't have that. We just had naked partisan driven attempts at censorship. So that's what I'm talking about. If you get that kind of vigilante censorship, even if it is by an intermediary or by a direct order, I think the case is implicated.
Martha, first of all, I'm still feeling all lovely about your wonderful students and their success.
Me too.
That is such a ray of light in a relatively dim landscape. But it makes me wonder about school boards. I understood, or I understand that for several years, there's been a determined campaign to get as many religious right, radical right school board members on the boards as possible, because those aren't elections lots of people pay attention to. And so I understand that the school boards across the country are stacked against the First Amendment. Is that an accurate statement, do you think?
Well, not necessarily true of my own school board, to my knowledge, although there are attempts being made to change that right now. 3 of the people who were actively involved in attempting to remove books from our library in the last school year are now running for school board. But you don't have to go too far this week to see evidence of that. There's a wonderful reporter out of Texas. His name is Mike Hixenbaugh. I suggest everyone listening to this start following Mike Hixenbaugh on Twitter, Hixenbaugh. He is doing excellent reporting. And interestingly, yesterday, he published an article, I believe it's on msnbc.com, that got commentary, a lot of interest, both from the left and the right. Steve Bannon was talking about Mike Hixenbaugh's article yesterday because it referenced Bannon. And Hixenbaugh quotes Bannon as saying that school boards are the key to the lock for the right. They are absolutely going after school boards as part of their essential strategy. So as I said, I'm not seeing that influence to that extreme yet here in New Jersey, but believe you me, our viewers in Texas and Oklahoma are feeling it big time. And school boards are essential in this process because they ultimately are the ones who will make the decision about whether the book stays or goes in the district. And the important thing here is that school boards have policies to follow, and what's been very troubling in many, many of the instances, including my own, is that school boards are not following their own policies. For example, in my case, the situation where the group of parents got up to have a protest at the board meeting, well, that's out of bounds immediately.
Right.
Had the board followed its own policies at that board meeting, they could have stopped that commentary and said, I understand you're here to discuss books. We have a process and a policy for how book complaints shall be submitted. Here is the form you should use. Your time at the microphone is now over. Instead, they let this rant go on in excess of the 3 minutes that is typically allotted for board time. And in the process, I was defamed. So that in that very instance of managing their own meetings, they're not following their policies. We also have to, as observers, make sure that the process they are using conforms to the policies and processes that they have stated. So you really need to closely observe it for compliance. Even after the challenge has been adjudicated and the board has decided, regardless of the outcome, whether the outcome was positive for the books or negative, people should really do a very close kind of post-mortem debrief of what happened. In our case, as I said, we were successful. The 5 books were retained. Nevertheless, we sent to the board a 17-page document where we outlined the numerous policy and process lapses that we observed in the 4 months that this was going on. We provided a line-by-line rebuttal of the Reconsideration Committee's recommendation to remove this book as gay. I should say that of the 5 books, the Reconsideration Committee was fine with keeping 4 of them, but wanted to remove and recommended to the board that they remove this book as gay. They wrote 132 words, I believe, to justify that decision. Almost every one of them inaccurate. So we submitted a line-by-line rebuttal to that. Furthermore, we also provided practical suggestions to the board for improving future reconsideration processes. Things like a quality rubric for what the reconsideration report should look like, improving their timelines, providing status at the board meeting. This went on for 4 months. We heard not a word about anything for 4 months. Providing status at the board meetings about what's happening. Requiring that administrators communicate with librarians when there are book challenges. I was not notified, for instance, when All Boys Aren't Blue was thrown onto the heap. And we also recommended that the board adopt some guidelines about preventing nuisance challenges. There is nothing in the policy that would prevent these aggrieved parents from turning around immediately and challenging these same 5 books again. I calculated that dealing with these book challenges cost the board, in terms of physical dollars and productivity time, roughly $1,600 per book challenged. Multiply that by 5, they spent $8,000 in material and productivity over the course of 4 months to do what now? Have the books sit on the library shelf exactly as they were in September. That's a waste of time and money. And I also, toward that end, designed actually, a more robust intake form so that the complainant would need to provide more information and a stronger rationale for withdrawing the book. As of this date, that report was submitted on January 29th. The board has not done anything. It's also important to remind the board that everyone involved in this situation is a potential voter. We created a scorecard for the January board meeting so that viewers of the board meeting could keep track of which members of the board voted to support students' right to read and which members voted to ban books. And we advise people, post that on your refrigerator so that when November rolls around, you'll remember who does not deserve to sit on that board any longer. And we also consistently reminded the board that these students who are speaking in front of you today are tomorrow's voters, and they will remember what you say and do here.
Did you put all of this in an action kit that you could share?
Yes, I will share that with you. The work I'm referencing was done under the banner of the North Hundred and Voorhees Intellectual Freedom Fighters, which is an ad hoc group that grew up in 2019. I'm sad to say that this 2021 situation was not my first experience with this. In 2019, there was an attempt to ban Fun Home that kind of mimicked some of the situations that Will was talking about earlier. That is when the superintendent directed me on his unilateral demand to remove Fun Home from the school library, claiming that it was pornography. He later in writing claimed that it would debauch the morals of minors to have the book there. I refused to remove it. As I mentioned, that led to a protracted debate and the book remained. But as I mentioned, it was challenged again in 2021, and the superintendent's own reconsideration committee determined that Fun Home was worth staying. In any event, the North Hundred and Voorhees Intellectual Freedom Fighters was established in 2019 around that Fun Home situation, and we reinvigorated in 2021, got the band together again in 2021 to fight this. And they have a website. I will provide information on that.
So librarians and lawyers seem to be really on the front line, particularly librarians. Lawyers have to face judges. Librarians have to face school boards and parents.
Yeah, all credit due to Martha and librarians. That's right. Lawyers get to show up maybe afterwards, but yeah, the librarians are doing the hard frontline work. And Martha, as a New Jersey resident, I just want to say, if you ever run for governor, you got my vote, right? That's a kind of dedicated.
The governor called me last week.
Well, there you go. Good. I'm glad Governor Murphy gave you a call. That's important because
I didn't know what hit him, because as soon as he started talking, I'm like, Governor Murphy, there are ways you can help, and I gave him a 3-point action plan.
Well, that's exactly what I'm talking about. This seems to me to be perfect common sense advice of how to shore up. Right? We talked about soft targets, how to make this a hard target, how to shore up existing protections via policy, so that we're not just talking about ad hoc, off the cuff. Hey, I read this, on a website somewhere, and these are the books that you're going to pull. I mean, that was perfect. Folks, if you get nothing else from that, just watch that again and let's take notes. That's it.
Well, we have about 15 more minutes. I keep forgetting to mention that the book And Tango Makes Three, I hear people talk about it and that it's censored and that they don't want their children exposed to it. And I can't ever stop myself from saying, you do know this is a book about penguins. It's the speech that offends is about a lifestyle that offends or engenders fear.
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes even speech that I think you got to look really hard to find any kind of offense in. My wife and I, we've got a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old, and for years we read them this book, Everywhere Babies. So imagine our shock and surprise when Everywhere Babies was, named on the list as some kind of subversive influence. Sometimes I think these folks just need hobbies, right? You got to find something else to do. You got a lot of energy. It takes a lot of work to find something to get worked up about here. But on a serious note, I think about the partisanship. It is important to note, and to try and talk across difference here, because just as you said, I think Martha earlier, is that folks are no longer talking to each other, right? So I went on a podcast that I think is geared to more of a right of center audience, and so I took this as an opportunity to say, the question was put to me: what do you do if you're a parent, right? If you're listening to this podcast and you're a parent who gets a book or gets a book in the library that your kids check out from the library that you find, inappropriate or jarring, what do you do? And I said, well, the thing you don't do is rush off to Facebook and say, my child is being groomed or something, something like that. What you would do is start a conversation. You talk to your kid, first of all, you talk to your librarian, and you start figuring out how to respond to this in a way that encourages speech, dialogue, and understanding. And just as Martha said earlier, if the book is not for you, the book is not for you. The great thing about the library is no one's forcing you in there, right? There's a classic First Amendment quote that I'm going to mangle from the justices, which is like, the answer to this kind of speech is to simply avert your eyes, right? It's not the book for you. Great. There are others that will be. So I'd like to kind of remind folks who are on the right side of the partisan divide, and unfortunately it is a kind of a yawning chasm these days, that in a set of circumstances that would just frankly mirror the current one, you could find speech about guns on the chopping block. You could find speech about faith on the chopping block. You could find the Bible on the chopping block. There was this amazing segment on Fox News just this past week when the challenge process, I think at a Texas district, and Martha, perhaps you know for sure, was such that people could just submit the title and the book would be preemptively pulled as a function of the submission of the challenge, right? So there's no procedural review, there's no gatekeeping, there's no assessment. It's just a standard mechanical, this book has been challenged, off it goes while we figure out what to do with it. So of course somebody put the Bible on, and the Bible is challenged. And next thing you know, you got 4 talking heads on Fox saying, can you imagine that doesn't this allow the few to decide for the many what's good? And I thought, there you go, folks. Now you get it. I mean, that's it, right? Like, that's the whole point. So I truly believe, as somebody who works for a proudly nonpartisan organization, works with folks from across the political spectrum, that if you speak to self-interest and you frame it in that way, to say, yeah, maybe, here you're nervous about these books, but imagine another set of parents, just another band of parents that says, we don't want, I don't know, pick a book, any book, right? We don't want that on the shelves. And you would find it just as an affront to your child's right to read and discover the world for themselves, as these folks do as well, right? So it depends on where you are in the country, man. There are different groups will be in different statuses, and imagining the shoe on the other foot can be powerful medicine. So I encourage that message to go out and see what we can do with it.
The issue is always whose hand holds the pencil, drawing the line.
An even simpler switch is to substitute the word book for the word gun.
Right.
If you say we're going to ban your guns, you get the whole cold dead hands response. But
well, this is not going to stop with books. It's not going to stop with books. It's not going to stop with the battles for internet freedom of speech. It's not going to stop with conversations just about LGBTQ individuals. This is, as Martha indicated early in our conversation, this is a coordinated plan. Our speech is being pushed closer and closer and closer into a very small box, and more of our speech and access to speech is being restricted by the government. And on the front line, Martha, are the libraries. So I want to give the people who will see this some idea of what they can do to defend book bans, to fight against censorship, to protect the libraries, to protect the librarians. Let me start with you, Martha, and ask you, what do you want people to take away from this?
I think the most important thing for me, and what I've counseled many librarians in the last number of months, is to realize that this is not a one-person job. Especially in a school library, many of us are used to being sole practitioners, and you cannot do this alone. You need to be willing to seek help and receive help and ask for help. And so that means reaching out to organizations like Every Library, organizations like the ALA, National Coalition Against Censorship, PEN America, reaching out to your library community. Librarians are awesome. And you go after one librarian, you go after all of us. We're after you. So you have to reach out to your broader community. And I am here to tell you, you also must take care of yourself. We didn't get into this, but through the course of those 4 months that I was fighting, the situation became so intense and included things like hate mail, vandalism in the library, and so on, that there came a point in time where my physical, mental, and emotional health suffered. And my doctor pulled me out of the workplace for about a month. So you really need to think now, what is your self-care plan? So, get yourself some allies and make yourself an ally in really caring for yourself. And then all the other stuff, there's lots of toolkits out there and other things that you can follow step by step, but you need a little army with you, and then you need to be a best friend to yourself.
Is it hopeless with the school boards, or can people affect change on the school boards?
Well, I think I am exhibit A that it is not hopeless. And the fact that I have a generation of First Amendment warriors behind me in those students is also evidence that it's not hopeless. So there is definitely hope.
Hell yeah. Let me co-sign that as loudly as possible. And also to Martha's excellent points, right? Get allies, take care of yourself. Remember, the students are watching the whole time. I think bravery can be contagious, right? So if one person stands up, I firmly believe, again, got to be an optimist here. I firmly believe that the majority of folks who are busy leading their lives, we see this as another headline. If you make that real to them, like, hey, they're pulling these books out, they're making people feel afraid, they're sending hate mail, they're sending death threats, people are losing their jobs. I think now is the time to call to action the great American majority that I still believe in, that absolutely rejects the attempts of small political bands to decide for the rest of us what we can and can't read. I think we're in the right here. I think we've got majority opinion behind us. I think the internet is isolating, social media is isolating, and picking off people, making them feel afraid is the bully's tactic. But strength in numbers, and I firmly believe that we will get through this, and we will once again kind of champion the idea of freedom to read for all, free access to ideas, and that will be the winning place. So yeah, I think that it requires all of us to speak out, even though librarians are on the front lines, but librarians have friends too who aren't librarians. They need to speak out. They need to tell a friend. If you see it happen, call it out, right? If you see this kind of censorship happen, call it out, because you got to win the legal battle, but you really also have to win the larger cultural battle to make the norm freedom of access to reading books and not book banning. That should be the cultural norm. It's not the other way around. And I think that with some dedication, some bravery, that will win out again. Also, I should note, if you're a librarian listening to this, if you're a high school librarian in particular, and your school board is marching in and talking about this kind of vigilante top-down censorship that we've been discussing, the organizations Martha mentioned, PEN America, NCAC, are fantastic. FIRE is very interested in talking to you about. We would like to strengthen PICO. I mentioned before it was a fractured court. I'd love to get some stronger precedent on the books. We'd be very interested. We have a team of litigators who would love to talk to you. My email is will, WILL, @thefire.org. So if you are being ordered by your board to disregard whatever policy you have and being asked to pull off books on a partisan basis, give me a shout. We'd love to hear from you.
Martha, how could people connect with you if they want to?
My personal email is mehickson, HICKSON, @comcast.net.
Okay. Any last comment?
I know I don't have to urge this audience, but voting is key.
Right.
If you have family members, friends who don't tend to vote, they've got to vote, and they need to pay attention to their school board elections. We already heard Steve Bannon commenting on that. And again, support the organizations that support us. Every library, Unite Against Book Bans, that's the ALA's toolkit, NCAC, Freedom Fighters down in Texas, that's freedom, FREADOM.US. Red, Wine, and Blue is a newer organization on the team. They have a book ban busters group, and they also do troublemaker training. If you're not used to making trouble, Red, Wine, and Blue will train you. And then, send a love letter to a librarian. If you're not a librarian and you're listening to this, send a card, a message of support to a librarian. We really need it. It's rough.
That's a great idea. Thank you. Martha, would you repeat, I hate to repeat anything that he says, but would you repeat what Bannon said about libraries?
About school boards?
That's what the key to the...
He said that the school boards is the key that picks the lock. That is their secret weapon to pushing their whole agenda.
If you have time and you're listening to this and you have inclination, run for your school board. Bring a rational voice to the discourse. I want to thank you both for joining me today. And I want to thank Callie, our ASL interpreter. Thank you so much. Woodhull has a petition launching September 7th. We are fighting an act called the Earn It Act. Essentially, short version, this is an act that says you have freedoms, you have rights on the internet. If you are a platform, we're going to take those rights away, and then you can earn them back if you follow rules set by some undetermined committee, and that undetermined committee will then decide if you have the rights you already had back again. Another step in this war to move us into the box, and we're not going to let it happen. I want to thank every library again for having us, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here. Thank you.